At his own son's wedding, Richard's world shattered when his 7-year-old grandson Daniel clutched his hand and whispered in terror, "Grandpa, you didn't look under the table, did you?" In that instant, the music, the laughter, the glow of candlelight, all of it turned hollow, poisoned by the chill of a child's fear. The whisper was not just a warning, it was a blade cutting through the illusion of family celebration, and Richard knew something unspeakable was waiting beneath that white tablecloth. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from, because what he uncovered next will leave you breathless. The ballroom glowed with golden candlelight, laughter rising above the clink of wine glasses, and polished silver gleamed as waiters glided between tables with trays held high. To anyone else it was a perfect scene, the kind of celebration people dreamed about, a night filled with champagne toasts and polished shoes shuffling across marble floors. But Richard felt none of it. His chest was tight, his jaw clenched, and every flicker of candlelight only deepened the unease twisting in his gut. The illusion of joy wrapped itself around the room like a suffocating curtain hiding something darker, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He watched his son Jonathan moving with practiced charm, offering smiles that seemed carved into his face, toasting relatives he barely spoke to during ordinary days. Jonathan's laughter rose too loud. His grin stretched too wide, as if the joy he wore was nothing more than a costume. Richard had raised that boy, taught him how to ride a bike in the backyard, watched him grow from scraped knees to crisp suits. But tonight, as Jonathan raised another glass of champagne, Richard could barely recognize him. It was as if the man had built walls of glass around himself, walls that reflected happiness, but revealed nothing of the truth inside. Across the ballroom, Claire, the new bride, stood in a shimmer of white beads and sequins, surrounded by friends whose laughter rang like crystal breaking on stone. She posed, tilting her head just so, pressing her lips into a smile that seemed too precise, too rehearsed, like a mask held in place by sheer will. The flash of cameras lit her face in bursts of artificial light, and each time Richard felt a twinge in his chest, a whisper of danger, though he could not yet name it. Claire's beauty was undeniable, but it was the kind of beauty that hid sharp edges, the kind that cut when no one was watching. The band in the corner drifted into a smooth jazz melody, the kind of music meant to soothe and celebrate, but to Richard it sounded like static underwater, muffled and heavy. The laughter of the guests around him blurred into a dull roar, voices weaving together into something that no longer felt human. The polished surface of the celebration gleamed too brightly, as though every detail had been scrubbed clean to distract from what lay beneath. The roses at the center of each table stood too straight, their petals almost wax in their perfection, unnatural. Even the candle flames seemed choreographed, swaying in time with the music, as if the entire evening were staged for some sinister performance. Richard shifted in his chair, his hand still clasping his grandson Daniel's small fingers, and for a moment he envied the boy's innocent distraction. Daniel pushed his red toy car back and forth across the linen tablecloth, his eyes fixed on the tiny vehicle as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. But Richard noticed the way Daniel's shoulders hunched closer, the way his movements grew more rigid, as if even the child sensed that this glittering room was not safe. A child's instincts rarely lied. He tried to focus on his grandson's toy, the bright red streak against the white cloth, but his gaze was pulled again toward the far side of the room. He saw Claire lift her wine glass, her wrist gleaming under the chandeliers, and whisper something to a woman beside her. Both laughed, the kind of sharp laugh that made Richard's stomach twist. He had lived too many years to mistake genuine warmth for performance. Something in that laughter carried malice, a note of satisfaction, too pointed to be innocent. The air grew warmer, heavier, as more guests flooded the dance floor, swirling under the golden chandeliers, their shoes clicking against marble like the ticking of a clock counting down to some unseen disaster. Richard could taste the bitterness of the wine he had barely touched, metallic and sharp at the back of his tongue. He set the glass down, pushing it away, his eyes narrowing as he tried to pierce the veil of festivity. A waiter passed with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, the scent of shrimp mingling with garlic butter drifting toward their table. Richard's nostrils flared. He knew Daniel's allergy knew one bite could close his throat in minutes. Why would shrimp be passed so freely so close to where his grandson sat? He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was nothing unusual at a wedding, but the unease only deepened. When Daniel quietly pushed the shrimp platter farther away with his small hand, Richard's chest tightened. The boy knew. He was already on guard. The false celebration pressed in on him. Every laugh seemed a little too loud, every toast a little too scripted, and beneath it all pulsed a current of menace. He scanned the guests, their polished shoes, their silk dresses, their carefully painted faces. Some smiled too long. Some watched too closely. It was as though half the room was performing and the other half was waiting. His gaze returned to Jonathan, the son he had once taught to stand tall, to be honest, to never turn his back on family. Jonathan's smile flickered for the briefest second, and in that flicker Richard saw exhaustion, emptiness, maybe even regret. Then the smile returned, bright and blinding, and he moved on to the next guest, as though nothing had happened. Richard's chest ached with the truth he dared not say aloud. His son was trapped in a web he either refused to see or had chosen not to escape. The music swelled again, violins rising above the steady beat of the drums, but Richard could not shake the pounding of his own heart. The entire ballroom felt like a stage set, every actor playing their part, every gesture rehearsed, every word carefully placed. And he was the only one who sensed that behind the velvet curtains and golden light, something monstrous was about to step into view. He glanced down at Daniel, who had grown still, his tiny car resting motionless on the tablecloth. The boy's clear eyes lifted to meet his grandfather's, wide and unblinking, and in them Richard saw fear. Not the fleeting fear of a child who had dropped his toy or heard a loud noise, but a deeper fear, the kind that freezes the body and chills the blood. Richard squeezed his hand, trying to reassure him, but his own pulse raced faster, louder, until it drowned out the music entirely. The false celebration went on, oblivious glasses raised in toast after toast, as though joy could be manufactured with champagne and candlelight. But Richard knew better. He felt it in his bones, in the way the air pressed against his skin, in the way his grandson trembled beside him. Something dangerous was hiding beneath this glittering surface, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and he knew with a terrible certainty that the mask of celebration was about to crack. And then Daniel leaned closer, his breath warm against Richard's ear, his voice a fragile whisper that sliced through the roar of the ballroom. "Grandpa, please don't look under the table." The room around him blurred, the golden chandeliers dimmed, and in that moment Richard understood that the illusion was over. The danger he had felt pressing in all night was real, closer than he had ever feared, and hiding right at his feet. What he would uncover beneath that white linen would not only shatter the false celebration but expose the venom at its core. Daniel's small hands guided the red toy car across the starched white tablecloth, its wheels leaving no trace, yet its presence grounding Richard in a way nothing else could. The ballroom around them pulsed with forced laughter and champagne toasts, but for Richard the boy was the only real thing in the room, the only pure thread of joy left after years that had stripped so much away. Every line on Richard's face carried the memory of losses too heavy to name, and though the years had taken friends, his wife, and most of the life he once knew, Daniel's quiet presence beside him felt like a fragile tether keeping him from drifting into despair. He leaned closer, watching the boy's serious expression as the toy rolled back and forth. Daniel didn't smile the way most children did when lost in play. His eyes were too sharp, too aware, as though he understood more than a child of 7 ever should. Each time the toy car paused at the edge of the plate, his gaze flickered upward, not at his grandfather, but across the crowded hall, scanning faces with a caution that chilled Richard. The innocence of the game barely concealed the fear woven into his movements. Richard felt the warning in those eyes like a blade sliding under his ribs. Daniel's small voice earlier still echoed in his head, the whisper that had sliced through the celebration and turned the glittering room into a cage. "Don't look under the table." The words would not leave him. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, a child's imagination, but the boy's trembling hands and pale lips said otherwise. Children did not invent dread this raw. They absorbed it from the world around them, from dangers too real to be spoken aloud. He reached out, resting his hand gently over Daniel's. The boy's fingers were cold, the chill seeping into Richard's skin, sending a shiver through him. He squeezed softly, a silent promise that he was there, that whatever darkness had crept into this wedding, it would not consume the boy while he still drew breath. Yet even as he made the vow, Richard knew how fragile it was. The false celebration pressed closer, voices rising, glasses clinking, and beneath it all the unspoken warning in Daniel's eyes only grew sharper. A waiter passed by offering a plate of appetizers, and Daniel flinched so slightly that only Richard noticed. He followed his grandson's gaze and saw the shrimp glistening under the lights. His throat tightened. He remembered the hospital visits, the oxygen mask, the frantic rush after a careless mistake. Shrimp was death to Daniel, and yet here it was, moving so freely through the air as if guided by invisible hands determined to test fate. Richard waved the tray away with a hard shake of his head, his jaw set. The waiter smiled politely, but Richard caught the flicker of confusion. Or was it something else before he moved on? Daniel resumed his game, pushing the car slowly now, the motion deliberate, as if every roll of the wheels measured time slipping away. Richard's chest ached. The boy should have been carefree, should have been laughing with cousins, sneaking cake, running on the dance floor. Instead, he sat here beside him, eyes shadowed with secrets too heavy for his small shoulders. Richard leaned down, whispering softly, so only the boy could hear. "I've got you, son. Nothing's going to happen to you tonight." But even as the words left his lips, he wondered if they were true. He saw the way Daniel's gaze darted again toward the far corner of the room where Claire stood, her jeweled gown glittering under the chandeliers. The bride's smile was dazzling for the cameras, but her eyes never softened. Daniel's grip on his toy car tightened, his knuckles white. The bond between them thickened in that moment, unspoken yet undeniable. Richard felt the boy's fear as if it were his own, pulsing through the space between their hands, demanding he stay alert. He thought of the nights after Emily died, when Jonathan had retreated into silence, and Richard alone had carried the burden of helping Daniel sleep, helping him find comfort in a world that had suddenly grown cruel. He had told him stories, walked him under starlight, promised that family meant safety. That bond was not fragile. It was steel forged in grief, but tonight that steel was being tested. He saw Daniel glance toward the table again, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak, then pressing together tightly instead. The boy's eyes lifted to his grandfather's once more, and what Richard saw there struck him harder than any blow. It wasn't just fear. It was knowledge. Daniel knew something terrible that he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. The toy car rolled off the edge of the table and clattered softly onto the marble floor. Daniel didn't reach for it. He sat frozen, staring straight ahead, as if the sound of that fall had confirmed his worst fear. Richard bent to pick it up, his fingers brushing the cold marble, and when he set the car back on the table, Daniel grabbed it and held it against his chest as though it were a lifeline. Richard's mind raced, threading together every uneasy detail the shrimp offered. Too close, the forced laughter, the glances exchanged across the room, and now his grandson's desperate silence. He could no longer dismiss it as nerves. The child's warning was not born of imagination. Something deliberate was unfolding, something malicious that had slipped beneath the glitter of the night. He straightened in his chair, his hand firm around Daniel's, his eyes scanning the room with the clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime watching others reveal themselves in moments they thought no one was looking. The music swelled, couples laughed, the night pressed on, but Richard's pulse steadied, his senses sharpening. Daniel leaned closer again, his voice low, urgent, almost broken. "Grandpa, please don't." The plea was not the voice of a child asking for comfort. It was a command born of terror, a desperate attempt to protect him from something he was not yet ready to face. Richard's blood ran cold. He drew in a long breath, the air thick with the scent of roses and candle wax, and he understood with brutal clarity that whatever was hidden in this room had already reached for his grandson. The boy's fear was not a shadow. It was a map pointing toward a danger crouching in plain sight, waiting for him to uncover it. And as Richard sat frozen in that golden glow, hand gripping the boy's, he knew he was only one step away from tearing back the mask of celebration and exposing what lay beneath. What he would find next would not only explain the fear in his grandson's eyes, but shatter the illusion of family forever. Richard's eyes followed Jonathan as he moved through the crowd, his smile wide, his laughter rising above the noise like a man who had finally outrun his demons. Yet Richard knew better. He had seen the hollowness beneath that grin, the way his son's shoulders carried a weight that charm alone could not conceal. Jonathan shook hands with relatives, accepted congratulations from strangers, and leaned down to kiss Claire's cheek with the elegance of a man who had mastered the performance of happiness. But Richard saw the subtle stiffness in his gestures, the fleeting shadows that crossed his eyes when no one else was looking. The scars of the past were not gone. They had only been dressed in expensive fabric and hidden under bright lights. Richard felt pride bloom and ache all at once. He had raised this boy through years of hardship, taught him to stand tall when the world seemed intent on breaking him, and yet watching him now. Richard wondered if all that strength had turned into something fragile beneath the surface. Pride for the man his son appeared to be wrestled with sorrow for the man he feared Jonathan had become. He longed for the boy who once ran across their backyard barefoot, the boy who had clung to his hand after nightmares, who had trusted him without hesitation. Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared, replaced by this polished figure, who belonged more to the world of fleeting applause than to the warmth of family. As Jonathan raised his glass for yet another toast, Richard remembered the nights they had spent at the old kitchen table after Emily's death. The boy silent, staring at untouched food, refusing to speak of the mother he had lost. Richard had sat with him in silence, waiting, hoping, praying the boy would let him in. But Jonathan had buried his grief deep, and over the years, it had hardened into something unspoken. Now, seeing him beam under the chandeliers, Richard felt the sting of all the words they had never exchanged. Claire slipped her arm around Jonathan's waist, and he leaned into her as though it were second nature. To the watching crowd, it was a picture of devotion, but Richard's eyes caught the way Jonathan's smile tightened just slightly, like a man bracing himself against a cold wind. Claire whispered something in his ear, and his jaw stiffened before he let out a laugh that did not reach his eyes. Richard's chest tightened. He longed to step forward to pull his son aside to ask him what mask he was wearing tonight and why. But he stayed still, rooted to his chair, because he knew his words would bounce off the walls Jonathan had built around himself. The music swelled, couples began to dance, and Jonathan took Claire's hand, guiding her to the floor with perfect grace. Richard watched as they moved, his son's posture impeccable, his steps practiced, his smile bright enough to dazzle every guest. Yet Richard saw the truth flicker with each turn, in the way Jonathan's eyes darted once toward the corner of the room, in the way his hand lingered too long at his side after releasing Claire from a twirl, as though he needed to remind himself what role he was playing. Richard longed to believe his son had found peace, but sorrow whispered otherwise. The longing pressed harder against his chest when Daniel shifted beside him, clutching the toy car once more. The boy's eyes, wide and unblinking, never strayed from his father on the dance floor. Richard followed that gaze and realized the grandson had seen the same fracture in Jonathan's smile. It was not just a child's fear that had unsettled him earlier. Daniel was watching his father with the same piercing clarity Richard had carried for years. The boy knew something was wrong. Richard's mind spiraled back to the afternoons when Jonathan was Daniel's age, afternoons filled with scraped knees and stubborn pride. He remembered patching him up after a fall, holding him steady until the tears stopped, and telling him he would always be there to catch him. Now, sitting in this gilded hall, Richard longed to reach through the years and hold his son steady once more. But Jonathan was no longer the boy who needed catching. He was a man drifting into something Richard could no longer grasp. The pride lingered, still stubborn as ever. Pride in the resilience that had carried Jonathan through years of pain. Pride in the charm that won him admiration tonight. Pride in the fact that he had built a life after loss. but that pride was laced with sorrow so sharp it burned. Richard's longing was not for what Jonathan had, but for what had been lost between them, the bond that had thinned with silence and hardened smiles. As the dance ended and applause rippled through the crowd, Jonathan bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the cheers. But when his eyes lifted, they met Richard's across the room. For a single heartbeat, the mask slipped. Richard saw the rawness, the exhaustion, the fear that the polished surface could no longer hide. His heart clenched. He wanted to rise to cross the floor to tell his son he didn't have to carry this alone. But just as quickly the moment was gone. Jonathan looked away, his smile restored, and Richard was left with the echo of what he had seen. He leaned back in his chair, his hand tightening around Daniel's, the boy's fingers still cold. His longing swelled into something heavier, a certainty that the facade his son had built was about to collapse, and when it did, the wreckage would not spare anyone. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He felt the storm gathering in the room, a storm no smile or toast could hold back. And as he sat there torn between pride and sorrow, between the father he had been and the father he still longed to be, he realized that whatever lay hidden in this wedding would soon drag Jonathan's secrets into the open. The truth waiting to be uncovered would not only expose the cracks in his son's mask, but would force Richard to confront a betrayal far deeper than he had ever feared. Across the room, Claire stood like a jewel under the chandeliers, her gown shimmering with every tilt of her body, sequins catching the light as though they were programmed to dazzle. Cameras flashed, her friends circled her in a flurry of pastel silk and perfume. And each time the shutter clicked, she shifted her chin by a fraction, lifted her glass at just the right angle, and gave the kind of smile that looked flawless in photographs, but dead in life. Richard studied her, his stomach tightening. That smile wasn't joy. It was a mask painted and polished until it no longer belonged to a human being, but to something mechanical, a performance perfected through years of practice. Her beauty was undeniable, the kind that could command a room and silence a conversation, but there was no warmth beneath it. Richard had lived too many years, read too many faces not to notice the absence. She didn't glance at Jonathan the way brides were supposed to on their wedding day, not with tenderness or awe, but with calculation. When her eyes touched him, they were assessing, measuring, already weighing the cost of what he could provide. And when those eyes shifted elsewhere, her face relaxed, dropping for a breath before the mask snapped back into place perfect again for the next camera. Richard shifted in his chair. Daniel's hand still trapped in his own, and the weight of unease pressed harder against his chest. Something about Claire reminded him of predators he had seen in the wild on old camping trips years ago. Creatures that knew how to stay perfectly still, perfectly beautiful, until the exact moment they decided to strike. He watched her laugh with one of her bridesmaids, the sound high and bright, yet her eyes never laughed with her. They were sharp, cutting, always scanning. The crowd adored her. Aunts leaned in to compliment her gown. Uncles raised their glasses in admiration. Friends squealed over the sparkle on her finger. She gave them everything they wanted. The smile, the light touch on the arm, the tilt of the head that made them feel chosen. But Richard noticed how quickly she let them go, how her gaze drifted before their words even ended, how her attention snapped to the next admirer, with the precision of someone collecting tokens rather than connections. Every interaction was transactional, every smile a coin tossed into a machine. Jonathan stood beside her now, laughing on cue, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. Richard felt his throat tighten. His son looked proud, dazzled, as though he had convinced himself this was happiness. But even from across the room, Richard caught it, the subtle tension in Jonathan's jaw, the stiffness of his shoulders, as though her touch anchored him in a way he couldn't escape. Pride still warred with sorrow in Richard's chest, but now unease threaded itself through both cold and sharp. Claire lifted her glass for another toast, her diamonds scattering shards of light across the room. Guests leaned forward, eager for every word, and she gave them a speech that flowed like honey, thanking family, praising Jonathan, painting their union as a fairy tale. Yet the rhythm of her voice was too smooth, too rehearsed like a line she had spoken in the mirror a dozen times. Richard glanced at the faces around her, entranced, nodding, smiling, none of them noticing the faint emptiness beneath each word. But he saw it. He felt it. As the applause rose again, Claire leaned down, whispering something against Jonathan's ear. His face shifted just briefly. It was a flicker, a shadow across the mask of his own smile, and then it was gone. He nodded, kissed her cheek, and the crowd roared with approval, never knowing that what had passed between them was not love but command. Richard's breath caught. He longed to know what she had said, but more than that he feared he already understood. Daniel stirred beside him, his small hand gripping tighter around the toy car, eyes wide and fixed on Claire. The boy's unease mirrored his own, and Richard felt the bond between them tighten once again. If even a child could see it, the danger was real. The mask was perfect, but perfection was its own kind of tell. No one smiled that long, that hard, unless they were hiding something poisonous beneath. The music swelled again, guests swept back onto the dance floor, and Claire moved with them, gliding effortlessly, never missing a beat, her gown flowing like water. Richard couldn't look away. Each step, each laugh, each touch of her hand on someone's arm was too polished, too controlled. She was performing for them all, and the crowd loved it, blind to the cracks Richard could already see forming in the corners of her eyes. His chest tightened with dread. He had seen masks like this before in his long life, masks worn by people who wanted something so badly they were willing to bury their true selves until the moment they could strike. Claire wasn't celebrating tonight. She was securing her ground, laying claim to something, perhaps everything. Jonathan was already hers, wrapped tight in her polished grip. And if Richard's instincts were right, Daniel had sensed what Jonathan could not, that Claire's mask hid not just coldness, but intent. Richard leaned back, his eyes never leaving her, the pulse in his temples hammering in time with the music. The ballroom glowed brighter, the laughter louder, but the beauty of it all had curdled. Every polished surface reflected a lie, and every lie pointed back to the bride at the center of it. He took a long, steady breath, his hand tightening around his grandson's. His unease was no longer a whisper. It was a warning, sharp and undeniable. Something was coiled beneath that perfect mask, waiting. And when it revealed itself, Richard knew the glittering illusion of this wedding would collapse into something far more dangerous than anyone in the room could imagine. Every glance at Daniel pulled Richard backward through time, back to days when laughter filled rooms that now echoed only with silence. The boy's gentle features, the tilt of his head, even the way he clutched his toy car with quiet determination, all of it reminded Richard of Emily. Jonathan's first wife had carried warmth in every gesture, a softness that steadied those around her, and Richard could still hear her voice when she bent down to soothe Daniel as a toddler, speaking in tones that melted tantrums into giggles. She had been the kind of woman who made even the smallest gatherings feel like home, who could turn a worn kitchen table into the center of a universe with nothing more than a smile and a plate of pie. Richard remembered the first time Jonathan brought Emily to the house years before the wedding that bound her to their family. She had shaken his hand firmly, looked him in the eye, and called him Mr. Hale, until he insisted she use Richard. There had been no artifice, no mask, just a genuine light that seemed incapable of deception. He had known then that his son had found someone rare. On their wedding day, the air had felt different, lighter, purer. No one had forced smiles. No one had worn masks, and the vows they exchanged had trembled with sincerity. But memory is cruel, because it does not stop at joy. Richard remembered the night the phone rang, the night tragedy collapsed the fragile balance of their lives. Emily's absence had come like a sudden storm, tearing through walls, leaving Jonathan adrift and Daniel too young to understand why his mother's arms never returned. Richard had stood at the funeral with Daniel in his arms, watching his son's face harden, as though grief had poured molten iron over it. In the months that followed, the boy who had once been so open, so full of laughter, built walls that even his father could not breach. Now, sitting in the golden light of the ballroom, Richard felt the weight of those memories pressing against his chest. The warmth that Emily had brought into their lives lingered only in fragments. Daniel's smile, a certain tilt of his head, the echo of her kindness. Jonathan had tried to move forward to build something new, but what Richard saw across the room was not healing. It was a performance, a fragile construction layered over wounds that had never closed. Claire might wear her mask of perfection, dazzling those too blind to look closer, but to Richard, she was only a pale shadow of what once was. He studied Daniel more closely. The boy's eyes carried both his father's silence and his mother's light. There was a depth there, a wisdom beyond his years, as though he had inherited Emily's ability to see through surfaces. And it was that inheritance, Richard realized, that made his grandson's earlier whisper all the more terrifying. Daniel was not just frightened. He had recognized something. The innocence of his youth had not erased the sharpness of his mother's bloodline. He had seen what others could not, and it had left him shaken. Richard's chest ached with longing, for the days before loss had carved lines into all their faces. He could still picture Emily in the backyard, kneeling in the grass with Daniel in her lap, Jonathan tossing a ball across the yard while she cheered them on. The memory shimmered so vividly it nearly drowned out the music of the ballroom. For a moment he closed his eyes, willing himself to stay in that world where laughter was real and no shadows lingered in corners. But when he opened them, the glittering facade before him returned colder than ever. The memory of better days sharpened the contrast of what he saw now. Emily's absence was not just a void. It was a wound that had invited something darker to take root. Claire stood where Emily once had, wearing beauty-like armor, but Richard felt the hollowness in every move she made. And Jonathan, his son, had let that hollow beauty fill the space where real love once lived. Pride and sorrow tangled again inside Richard, but now unease pressed harder, whispering that the family's fracture was not simply born of grief. Something deliberate was at work here, something that Emily's presence once would have shielded them from. Daniel shifted, tugging at Richard's sleeve, and for a heartbeat, the boy's expression was so like his mother's that Richard nearly gasped. It was in the quiet strength of his eyes, in the way he silently pleaded for truth without needing words. The boy was Emily's legacy, and in him Richard found both comfort and dread. Comfort because her warmth lived on dread, because that same clarity had already shown him the danger at their table. Richard sat straighter, his mind racing as the echoes of Emily's kindness clashed against the cold performance surrounding him. The ballroom was filled with laughter and applause, but all he could hear was the fragile memory of a voice long gone, reminding him of what love was supposed to look like. It left him painfully aware of the counterfeit celebration unfolding before him. The weight of memory pressed harder still, and Richard realized that longing for what was lost was not enough. He had to face what was present. The boy beside him had inherited more than his mother's eyes. He had inherited her instinct for truth. And if Daniel's fear pointed to danger, Richard could no longer afford to dismiss it. He tightened his grip on the boy's hand, steadying himself as the music swelled and the room spun with movement and light. The ghost of Emily's warmth lingered in his heart, but in the reflection of her son's frightened eyes, he saw something else. An urgent warning that the past was not simply memory. It was prologue. And as Richard turned his gaze back toward the bride, her perfect mask unbroken, he felt the whisper of those better days slip further away, leaving only a certainty that what was hidden here tonight would not just threaten their fragile present but tear open the wounds of their past in ways none of them were ready to face. Daniel's toy car came to a halt, its red paint catching the glow of the candles for just a moment before slipping into stillness. His small hand froze on the table, and then it slid toward Richard's with desperate speed, gripping tight. The boy's fingers were icy, trembling, as if the chill of something unseen had climbed into his bones. Richard turned to him at once, his heart seizing when he saw it fear. Not the fleeting kind that startles a child for a heartbeat, but the heavy, consuming terror that drains color from the face and makes the eyes too wide, too knowing. Daniel leaned close, his lips barely parting, but his words struck with the force of a hammer. "I want to leave Grandpa. Please." His voice cracked, his breath shallow, every syllable shaking with dread. The boy's chest rose and fell too quickly, and Richard felt the sting of panic ripple through his own body. He tightened his grip, steadying him, though his own pulse thundered in his ears. He searched his grandson's face, hoping for some explanation, some glimpse of childish nerves, but what he found was worse. Daniel's gaze darted around the ballroom, scanning shadows lingering on faces too briefly before snapping away like prey surrounded by predators. Richard's own stomach dropped. The boy wasn't imagining this. He was responding to something real, something close. The music swelled with false cheer violins singing above the clink of crystal glasses, but Richard could barely hear it over the boy's shallow breaths. He wanted to pull Daniel into his arms to carry him straight out of that gilded prison of chandeliers and painted smiles. But the weight of the moment held him down. To leave now would be to draw attention to reveal the fear before they understood where it pointed. And Richard needed to know. He needed to see what his grandson had seen. Daniel's grip tightened, his nails pressing into the back of Richard's hand. His lips moved again, almost too quiet to catch. "Don't let go." His voice cracked, almost lost in the roar of laughter across the hall. Richard bent closer, shielding the boy with his body, whispering back steady words though his insides twisted. "I won't. I promise." The boy's eyes welled with tears. He refused to let fall. His jaw clenched in silence, far too heavy for his age. Richard felt a surge of rage rise inside him, sharp and hot. No child should carry fear like this. Not on a night meant for joy, not under the roof of family. He followed Daniel's gaze once more, and it led him toward the far end of the room where waiters passed with trays of champagne and shrimp cocktails. His throat constricted. He knew the allergy was a matter of life and death. And now he saw Daniel's fear sharpen every time one of those trays passed near. But there was more. Richard saw it in the way Daniel's eyes flicked not just at the trays but at certain faces. A groomsman leaning against the bar, eyes lingering too long on their table. A bridesmaid's whisper into Claire's ear, followed by a glance so fleeting most would have missed it. Daniel saw it all, and Richard realized the boy wasn't just afraid of food. He was afraid of people. The ballroom seemed to shrink, every glittering detail now sharpened into menace. The golden chandeliers cast pools of light that felt too bright, exposing them, and yet the shadows between tables seemed to swell, hiding threats just out of reach. Richard's unease solidified into certainty. Something was wrong here. Something was circling them. He brushed a strand of hair from Daniel's damp forehead, whispering again, this time low and steady. "We'll go soon. Just hold on." But Daniel shook his head, tears brimming, now his lips forming the word "no" without sound. Richard's throat tightened further. The boy wasn't asking anymore. He was warning. The celebration roared on, oblivious. Guests raised glasses, laughter echoed, and the bride spun in her glittering gown like the centerpiece of a grand illusion. But Richard's world had narrowed to the child beside him, trembling, pleading, carrying knowledge too dark for a 7-year-old to hold. His instincts screamed to lift the boy and walk out without a backward glance. Yet another voice, colder, sharper, told him to wait, to look, to uncover the shape of what had driven Daniel into this terror. Richard sat rigid, his hand gripping Daniel's, his eyes scanning the crowd with new intensity. Every detail was sharper now, the way Claire's smile stretched without reaching her eyes, the way Jonathan's laugh cracked at the edges, the way certain guests leaned together whispering when they thought no one noticed. The boy wasn't imagining it. The boy was seeing the cracks in the mask of celebration, and now Richard could see them too. The music shifted, drums rising, strings climbing, as though the band had been instructed to swell the illusion even higher. But no music could hide the tremor in Daniel's hand, the cold weight of fear that pressed into Richard's skin. The boy's eyes locked on him again, desperate pleading, a silent cry for protection. Richard's jaw clenched, his chest burning with the force of the promise he had already made. He would not let go. He would not allow the fear in those eyes to be justified. Yet deep inside he knew what was coming. Whatever had set this terror alight in Daniel's heart was not finished. It was waiting, watching, ready to strike. And as Richard held his grandson closer, His eyes darting toward the flickering shadows at the edge of the ballroom, he understood one truth with chilling clarity: this night was no celebration. It was a stage set for something far more dangerous, and the next act was already moving into place. Richard bent closer, his hand firm around Daniel's, trying to steady the trembling that seemed to run through the boy's entire body. The weight of his grandson's innocence pressed on him like a stone, a reminder that a child should never carry fear this heavy, never be forced to whisper warnings on a night that should have been filled with laughter and light. He murmured words of reassurance, though they felt hollow even as he spoke them. "It will be all right, Daniel. You're safe with me." But his own heart betrayed him, pounding harder with each second, each beat thundering in his ears, as he lowered his gaze toward the floor. The tablecloth draped low, its white folds swaying faintly with the air that moved through the ballroom. Richard leaned closer, lifting the fabric with a trembling hand, his breath shallow. The polished marble reflected the flicker of the chandeliers, casting fractured shadows under the table. His chest tightened as he scanned the darkened space, every muscle braced for what he might find. The weight of Daniel's small hand on his shoulder anchored him as much as it pleaded with him not to look. Yet Richard had no choice. He had to see. At first there was nothing but the shadows, the scuffed tips of polished shoes, and the faint glint of metal from the legs of the chairs. But then his eyes caught it, tucked in the corner near the base of the table leg. A small fold of paper half crushed its edges, curling as though it had been handled in haste. His pulse jumped. In the noise and revelry above it would have been invisible. But down here, beneath the surface of celebration, it stood out like a wound. Richard's hand trembled as he reached for it. The paper felt too light, too fragile, almost obscene in its ordinary texture given the dread it carried. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the hurried scrawl in the flicker of candlelight spilling beneath the cloth. A chill spread through his body, colder than the boy's icy fingers. The words were blunt, unpolished, and yet they carved terror into him with each line. Table 8. Add shrimp to the child's meal. The words blurred as his vision swam with rage. His breath caught his throat closing, his chest tightening until he thought he might collapse right there under the table. He gripped the note harder, crumpling it in his fist as he glanced at Daniel. The boy clutched his toy car to his chest, his wide eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He knew. Somehow the child had known. That was the weight Richard now felt pressing down on him, not only the innocence of a boy who should never have seen malice in the world, but the terrible burden of truth he had carried alone. Richard forced a steadying breath, his mind a storm of possibilities. Who had written it? Who had passed it beneath the table so quietly, so carefully, while the music and laughter masked their intent? He lifted his gaze, sweeping the ballroom again. Waiters moved with trays of sparkling glasses. Guests leaned in close, laughter spilling from painted lips. But behind the glitter, the danger pulsed like a second heartbeat. Someone in this room wanted Daniel gone, and they had chosen the cruelest, most cowardly way to attempt it. The boy's innocence made the crime all the more monstrous. Daniel had trusted this night to be safe, trusted the arms of family, the warmth of celebration. Instead, he had been forced to shrink into silence, carrying fear that no child should ever shoulder. Richard's throat burned with rage, but he held himself still. To erupt now would be to show his hand before he understood the scope of what lay against them. He could not afford to lose control. He folded the note back into his palm, sliding it into his pocket, and looked again at the boy. Daniel's lips moved in silence, eyes locked on his grandfather's, as though asking a question without sound. Richard answered with a slight nod, firm and deliberate. "I know," the gesture said, "and I will not let them win." The music swelled again, covering the pounding of his pulse, but Richard barely heard it. His focus had narrowed, his senses sharpened. The mask of joy that cloaked the ballroom had cracked, and through the fracture he could see the truth: a predator hid among them, dressed in silk and smiles. He would not let Daniel carry this alone. The weight of innocence was his burden now, and he would bear it with the fury of a father, a grandfather, a man who refused to let malice triumph in silence. He straightened in his chair, his hand tightening around the boys once more, and forced his face into calm. Around them the celebration raged on, blind and deaf to the danger woven into its glitter. But Richard knew the night had shifted. What he uncovered beneath that white cloth was not the end of Daniel's fear, but the beginning of a reckoning. And as he fixed his gaze on the crowd, scanning faces that smiled too easily and eyes that flickered too quickly, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. This was no accident. This was intent. And whoever had written that note was close, far closer than he wanted to believe. The shadows beneath the table stretched like a second world, one hidden from the glow of chandeliers and the roar of laughter above. Richard's breath slowed as his hand hovered near the floor, his knuckles brushing against the chill of the marble. Then his eyes caught it. A small folded scrap of paper resting in the dark, as if it had been left there deliberately waiting for him to find it. It was nothing more than a sliver of white against the void. Yet it pulsed with menace. His veins tightened, his chest hollowed, and for a moment the entire ballroom seemed to dissolve around him. He reached for it slowly, each second stretching long and unbearable, his heart pounding against his ribs with such force he thought the entire room must hear it. The paper was ordinary in texture, cheap, forgettable, the kind of thing tossed aside without a thought. But Richard felt its weight before he even unfolded it, a heaviness born not of ink but of intent. His fingers trembled as he pulled it into the faint glow of candlelight that slipped through the cloth above. The words were scrawled in a hurried hand, letters jagged and uneven, but their meaning carved into Richard like a blade. Table 8. Add shrimp to the child's meal. His breath stopped. The sound of laughter and music above turned to static, muffled and distant, as though the world had plunged underwater. He stared at the words again, praying his eyes had deceived him, that it was some mistake, a note for another purpose. But there was no mistaking the clarity of the instruction, no mistaking the cold precision in its simplicity. His throat tightened. He had seen malice in many forms throughout his long life, but this was something darker, something cowardly and deliberate. It wasn't just an attack. It was an execution dressed in silence, designed to look like an accident, a slip of food at a wedding feast. A child's death disguised as a mistake. Richard crumpled the note in his fist, his nails biting into his palm, and lifted his eyes slowly to the ballroom above. The glittering world had not changed. Crystal glasses still clinked, laughter still soared, couples still twirled across polished marble. But now every face, every smile, every careless gesture carried a new shadow. Somewhere among them was the hand that had written this note, the mind that had conceived it, the heart that had plotted to end a boy's life for reasons Richard could not yet grasp. Daniel's hand pressed against his arm, grounding him. Richard turned to see his grandson staring at him with those wide, knowing eyes. The boy had seen enough to understand. His fear had not been born of imagination. He had sensed the danger crouching beneath the surface, had felt it before Richard had uncovered its proof. Innocence had given him no protection. Instead, it had made him the target. Richard forced air into his lungs, steadying himself as he slid the note into his pocket. The urge to rise, to shout, to demand answers threatened to explode inside him, but he held it down with iron will. Rage would gain him nothing now. He needed clarity, precision, patience. The predator was still in the room, and if he revealed that he knew, they might strike faster, harder, without hesitation. His gaze swept the tables, lingering on faces that looked away too quickly, on the servants who moved with trays of glittering glasses, on Claire's perfect smile and Jonathan's strained laughter. The bride posed like a goddess under golden light, but Richard could not shake the question clawing at his mind. Was she the mask hiding the serpent? Or had the serpent chosen another face to wear tonight? The note burned in his pocket like a live coal. His pulse hammered in his temples. Daniel's breathing steadied slightly under his touch, but the boy's grip never loosened. He knew, as Richard knew, that something in this hall was watching them even now. Richard leaned closer, whispering softly, though the fury in his voice shook with barely contained restraint. "I've got you. They won't touch you. Not while I'm here." Daniel nodded, though his eyes still darted toward the shadows as if expecting the danger to step into the light at any second. The band struck up another song, louder, bolder, filling the hall with an energy that felt manufactured, desperate to drown the truth swelling beneath it. Guests cheered, glasses raised high, oblivious to the venom sliding through their celebration. Richard forced himself to match their calm, to lift his chin and sit straighter, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to shield the boy and run. But he would not run. Not yet. Whoever had left that note believed in silence, believed in shadows, believed they could strike unseen. Richard would not grant them that power. He would watch. He would wait. And when the mask slipped, he would be ready. His eyes locked once more on Jonathan, who leaned in to kiss his bride's cheek, his laughter brittle under the weight of expectation. Pride and sorrow twisted inside Richard, but now they were joined by something sharper, colder. Resolve. If his son was blind to the danger, then Richard would see for him. If his son had grown too entangled in performance to sense the predator, then Richard would drag the truth into the open with his own hands. The folded note lay heavy against his chest, its menace clear, its warning undeniable. And as Richard sat among the glitter and gold, holding his grandson close, he knew one truth with absolute certainty: the game had already begun. Someone here had revealed their hand, and soon Richard would discover whose mask would break first. Richard's fingers trembled as he spread the paper flat against his palm, the candlelight trembling with him, making the scrawled letters flicker as though the words themselves were alive and breathing. The writing was rushed, jagged strokes that cut into the page with urgency, and yet the message was horrifyingly clear. Table 8. Add shrimp to the child's meal. His breath snagged in his chest, his vision tunneling to nothing but the ink that spelled out death for his grandson. Daniel's allergy wasn't some trivial inconvenience. It was a guillotine blade hanging by a thread, and this note was the deliberate hand that sought to cut it loose. His chest constricted, a vice of rage and terror locking his ribs. The memory of hospital corridors flashed through his mind, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the shrill beeping of monitors, the frantic rush of doctors when a single trace of shrimp had nearly stolen Daniel's breath before. Richard had sworn then, holding his grandson's fragile hand through the oxygen mask, that he would never allow such a mistake again. But this was no accident. This was no careless slip of food on a plate. This was a weapon wielded in silence, hidden beneath the glitter of champagne and laughter. The sounds of the ballroom warped around him, muffled, distant, as though he were standing behind glass. Guests clinked their glasses together. Voices rose in merriment. The band's melody swelled. But to Richard it was nothing but hollow noise. He saw only the predator's words etched on the paper, the quiet violence of the command. Someone here among these polished smiles and dazzling gowns wanted a child dead. His grandson. He folded the note tightly, crushing it into his fist until the edges bit into his skin, a pain that anchored him. Rage pressed hot against his throat, demanding release, but he forced it back, burying it beneath the steel of control. To stand, to shout, to accuse would expose Daniel before Richard had the chance to protect him. He could not fight what he could not yet name. He needed to move like the predator had moved, quiet, deliberate, unseen until the moment of strike. His eyes swept the hall, dissecting the celebration with new clarity. Every smile carried suspicion, every laugh a veil, every guest a possible executioner. The waiters glided past with trays that glittered under golden light, but now each one was a threat, each plate a weapon disguised as nourishment. His gaze landed on Claire, her perfect mask of beauty gleaming for the cameras, her hand resting lightly on Jonathan's arm. She lifted her glass lips, curved in a flawless smile, and for the first time Richard wondered how deep the polish ran, how much she already knew. Jonathan, oblivious, beamed at his bride, his laughter stretched too wide. Richard's chest ached with the clash of pride and sorrow, but beneath it surged a darker current doubt. His son had been blind before, blind to grief, blind to cracks in the foundation of his life. Could he be blind now to danger circling his own child? Richard's heart thudded with the thought, the bitter taste of betrayal rising in his mouth. Daniel stirred beside him, the boy's small body rigid with fear. He hadn't spoken again, but his wide eyes told Richard everything. The child had felt it long before his grandfather uncovered the note. That innocence, sharpened by instinct, had pierced the illusion before Richard dared believe it. He slipped his hand into Richard's again, pressing hard, as though anchoring himself to the only person in the room who could shield him. Richard squeezed back his vow, silent but absolute. The band shifted into a lively tune, couples swirling across the floor, gowns, sweeping shoes tapping in perfect rhythm. The guests applauded, laughter swelling louder, a chorus of joy that only deepened the sick irony. Above the surface it was a fairy tale. Beneath it a trap had been set for a child. Richard's gaze drifted back to the folded note in his pocket, its edges sharp against his chest. It pulsed there like a heartbeat, a reminder that this was no game, no misunderstanding. This was attempted murder dressed in silk. He drew in a long breath, steadying himself, pulling strength from the rage he refused to unleash. He thought of Emily, of the warmth she once brought into their family, of the safety that had vanished with her. She would have fought like fire for her son and her grandson, and Richard knew he had no choice but to do the same. He could not fail them now. His eyes narrowed as they swept the crowd again, dissecting every glance, every whisper. Somewhere in this hall, the hand that had written those words was watching, waiting for the plan to unfold. Richard felt it, the invisible gaze, fixed on their table, the predator's breath in the shadows. He sat straighter, his grip on Daniel firm, his expression calm as stone. If they thought him blind, they were wrong. He had seen the note. He had felt its weight. The celebration spun on blind to the storm gathering beneath its polished surface. Guests toasted to love, to family, to futures that glittered like chandeliers overhead. But Richard knew better. Futures could be stolen in an instant, carved away with nothing more than a scrap of paper and a careless bite of food. He leaned close to Daniel, whispering so softly only the boy could hear. "Not tonight." His words were a promise sharpened by fury. He would not let his grandson's life be snuffed out by cowards hiding in silk. And as he lifted his eyes once more to the glittering crowd, his chest tight with resolve, he knew the next step would be the most dangerous of all. For now the game was exposed, and the predator would sense it. The night was no longer theirs to control. It was his. And soon someone in this hall would learn what it meant to provoke a man with nothing left to lose. Richard pulled Daniel against him, the boy's small frame trembling as though the fear had seeped into his bones. His heart thundered with a violence he had not felt in decades, a storm of rage and terror crashing inside him. Yet when he opened his mouth, his voice came out low, steady, controlled. He whispered reassurances Daniel could barely hear over the swell of the banned words meant to soothe, even as Richard's own mind screamed in defiance. On the surface he was calm, but within he burned. The paper in his pocket was not merely a warning. It was a declaration of war. And this ballroom, draped in gold and drowning in laughter, had become the battlefield. The clash was invisible to the crowd, but Richard felt it in every shadow that flickered against the chandeliers. Family and loyalty stood on one side, poisoned by betrayal and blindness. Hidden malice waited on the other, cloaked in silk gowns and polished shoes, smiling as they circled their prey. And in the center of it all sat a child, wide-eyed, fragile, carrying innocence like a target painted on his back. Richard's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding against words he dared not shout. He glanced across the room at Jonathan, his son still laughing too loud, clinking glasses, as if nothing had shifted. The sight twisted Richard's gut. Did his son know nothing? Was he so wrapped in the performance of joy that he couldn't sense the venom dripping into his own family? Richard's chest ached with the weight of disappointment and love, two forces colliding as fiercely as the war he now faced. He wanted to protect Jonathan as much as he wanted to shake him awake, to force him to see what danger they stood in. Claire moved elegantly through her circle of admirers, her flawless smile unbroken, her glass lifted high. Richard studied her every movement, every tilt of her chin, every flicker of her eyes. She looked like the queen of the evening, adored and admired, but to Richard she was a mask of porcelain, hiding something colder. Was she the architect of the note or merely a piece on someone else's board? He could not yet tell. But he knew this. She belonged to the enemy camp, whether by choice or by silence. Daniel's fingers dug into his sleeve and Richard bent closer, his lips brushing the boy's hair. "You are not alone. Not tonight." His vow was not loud, not shouted for the room to hear, but it burned with the power of a man who had seen loss and would never allow it to take root again. He would guard this child with everything he had left, even if it meant tearing apart the glittering illusions around him piece by piece. The music surged, horns blaring, couples spinning across the floor, their gowns and tuxedos blurring into a storm of color. The applause was thunder, the laughter a constant roar. To anyone else it was celebration. To Richard, it was cover noise to mask deceit, chaos to conceal malice. His senses sharpened, his instincts honed from years of survival. Somewhere in this crowd, the hand that had written those words was waiting, watching. Richard could almost feel their gaze pressing against him, testing him, daring him to act. His mind replayed the note's words again and again, each repetition deepening the fury coiled in his chest. Table 8. Add shrimp to the child's meal. It was so simple, so careless in its cruelty. No elaborate plan, no complex scheme, just a direct strike aimed at the smallest, weakest link in the family. That brutality made it worse. Whoever had done this had not just chosen Daniel. They had chosen innocence itself, turning a child into a weapon against his own blood. Richard tightened his grip on Daniel and forced his breathing into rhythm, steady and slow, masking the inferno inside. He knew the battlefield had rules, now, rules as old as survival itself. He could not move recklessly. He could not reveal his hand. The predator had already shown theirs, and that gave him an advantage, thin though it was. His vow echoed again in his mind, stronger each time. Protect the boy. Expose the traitor. Destroy the mask. His gaze flickered across the tables again, searching faces for cracks. He saw a groomsman whisper to another, their heads tilted too close. He saw a bridesmaid smile falter when she caught sight of him watching. He saw Jonathan's laughter ring hollow as his eyes darted to the side as if searching for escape. Every detail sharpened, every movement catalogued. The enemy was here. He could feel it. He leaned back, outwardly calm, his hand still steady on Daniel's shoulder. But inside, every nerve screamed that the night had crossed a line it could never retreat from. Family and loyalty, betrayal and malice, love and vengeance, all were colliding in this glittering hall. And Richard knew with chilling clarity that this was only the beginning. Somewhere hidden behind the music and the laughter, a mask was about to slip. And when it did, the war that had begun in silence would erupt in full view of them all. Life has a way of exposing the truth no matter how carefully it is hidden. In Richard's story, what began as a glittering celebration quickly unraveled into a lesson about vigilance, trust, and the power of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. For older adults, it speaks to a reality many already know. Appearances can deceive, and even within family, loyalty is not always guaranteed. But it also reminds us of the strength that comes with experience, the ability to see through masks, to recognize danger before others do, and to stand firm when innocence is threatened. Richard's silent vow to protect his grandson is a call for all of us to use our wisdom, patience, and courage to shield those who rely on us. It is proof that even in the most uncertain moments, calm resolve can turn fear into strength. If this message resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that stir the heart and remind us of the values worth holding on to.